welcome to episode number 6 of Base Level Podcast. I'm joined with Jacqueline Feldscher. I hope I pronounced that right. She is the managing editor at Payload. Payload is a space and business newsletter that covers, the policies of what is going on in the space industry. So, Jacqueline, thank you for coming on. We're really excited to do this episode and look forward to getting into the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
So I was looking a little bit about your background, and I saw that you've covered, the space industry, but you have a previous background in covering defense topics. How did you get started in journalism, and what was the appeal to covering space policy and defense topics as well?
So I've been a reporter for 12 years now. I actually initially wanted to get into journalism because I was a big baseball fan. I went to college in Boston, and I wanted to do sports journalism. Obviously didn't happen. I'm very, very happy it didn't happen because it's the path my career has taken has been very fun. So I ended up in coverage of sports. I covered a lot of concussions among athletes, which translated pretty naturally to writing about concussions among service members, among troops. And through kind of that avenue, got my first journalism job at Navy Times. So I definitely wasn't one of those people that kind of always wanted to cover defense, but I did it for a number of years and really loved it. I mean, foreign policy and national security is just a fascinating beat. There's always something going on, and it felt really important to be able to tell the stories of kind of our nation's defense and service members. I got into space in 2018 when I was at Politico. I started, covering space for them and writing their space policy newsletter. And I just love covering space. There's always something fun happening. It's fascinating. And unlike defense, where you have to, beg and plead and convince people to talk to you, the people who are working in space, they love what they do and they generally really want to talk about it. So it's great to be able to interview people who are truly really excited about really cool stuff that they're doing.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how your experience was in defense and, of course, the national security industry, trying to get information because a lot of it probably is classified, closed off, or, sometimes a little dark and people don't want to talk about it. So how did you traverse those conversations when you have to approach them?
Yeah, it's tough. And I think, it's something that is in common, whatever kind of journalism you're doing. You want to get interesting information that, people don't necessarily want out there. So I think it's just building relationships, and, proving that you can be trusted over time. It's really just something that takes time. But as, a younger reporter in the Pentagon, it was so frustrating to see reporters who were older than me, who had those relationships, get stories, even though like I was working so hard. So yeah, it's definitely a challenging beat, but extremely rewarding when you do build those source relationships and you're able to get stories. And as much as people are excited to talk about space, it's the same thing in space, that you really need to build relationships, and develop sources over time to be able to get more exclusives and more interesting information for readers.
That makes sense. Yeah. Tate mentioned earlier that I work in government software, and that's a big part of it is those relationships where I'm the young guy on the block, but there have been, these sales reps that have been there 25 years plus. So they know everybody, they know their kids' names, their dog names, their birthdays. And it's hard to get that, that rapport going. But once you get it, it's fantastic because then you have the opportunities that are typically closed off for those, friends and family per se.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that, Jonathan and I, we went to the Fed Supernova conference last week. It was hosted by Capital Factory in Austin. And, just looking around the crowd, I was telling Jonathan that him and I are probably the younger people here. And so, a lot of the people that we interacted with were, interested in kind of what the topics that we were covering, but just having access to that and even being taken serious can be a challenge, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because for a long time I was like the youngest person in the newsroom, and especially like covering Capitol Hill. I mean, all of the legislators are obviously much older. But now on the payload team, I am one of the older people. We have a very young, driven team. So it's funny to have that, flip.
And so I think Christian and I know what Payload is, but what is Payload? What do you all do? What do you all focus on? Just so our listeners can kind of get an idea.
Definitely. So we are a media startup that has been around for a couple of years. Our tagline is that we cover the business and policy of space. So we publish a daily space newsletter focused on a lot of space investments or other industry news, a lot of the kind of very interesting stories in the space industry that might be missed by some of the broader kind of more mainstream publications that cover launches and spacecraft. We kind of go a level deeper than that. We also have 2 weekly newsletters. One is a space science newsletter called Parallax that comes out on Thursday. And the other is Polaris, which is a space policy newsletter, which I write, which comes out every Tuesday. We also, we're not just, a digital writing business. We also have a podcast called Pathfinder that's hosted by our CEO. And we're really ramping up our events, the event side of our business as well. We have a big investor summit coming up out in LA a little bit later this year. So kind of a broad media company that covers the industry side of space.
Yeah, taking a look at some of the topics that you guys covered on the newsletter and on the podcast, I feel like it's very tailored towards people that are in the industry, correct? Do you guys sort of struggle with appealing to more of like a casual listener or a casual reader? Because for me, when we went to the Fed Supernova conference, we sat in on a couple of keynote speakers talking about space technology, and about the last hour I was just struggling, had to get up and go get another coffee. So how do you guys, I guess, traverse those challenges of dealing with those scientific jargon that can be really dense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an acronym filled sphere for sure. Most of our audience is, people who work in the space industry. So we, expect our audience to be space literate, for lack of a better word. We do, use some acronyms on first reference, like International Space Station. We just write, and so we definitely do target it to the people who need the newsletter. They need the information in the newsletter to do their jobs, not as much to the casual space enthusiasts. With that being said, we definitely write in a lighter style. We try to have some fun at Payload, and have gotten feedback that we make complex space topics a little more accessible. So I think, a casual space fan could read us, and I don't think they would be lost. I hope they wouldn't be lost, but we definitely do write assuming that the audience has some kind of knowledge base.
Yeah, I've been a space enthusiast since I was, young as a kid. But just kind of like the industry I'm in now, we call it the alphabet soup, right? Where you have all these acronyms, and sure, if you're in the industry, you know what it means. But if you're not, you have to do a little bit of research. But I will say, Payload does a great job of breaking down the topics and making it easy to read, right? I have subscriptions to Morning Brew, and there's another newsletter called Insight.com. But Payload does a really good job of taking these complex policies, these projects, these companies, and explaining what they're doing in a very simple way. So I appreciate you all for doing that. And it's fun to kind of get back into the space world after being out of it for so long. So I guess in that sense, though, I do have a question. How did you kind of traverse that alphabet soup and getting familiar with the topics and the jargon? Was it a high learning curve? Was it pretty easy to get into after defense? Or, how was that transfer?
I think coming from kind of the defense reporting world, definitely national security side of space, I kind of had, I would be on the phone with sources, and any acronym I heard that I didn't know what it was, I would write it down and then, Google it when I got home or whatever. So there's definitely a steep learning curve. But I also have found that it's no one, I think the people who do this know that they're dealing with, complex, sometimes confusing things. So I've never met someone who, made me feel bad for saying they'd be like, do you understand? And I could just be like, no, I have no idea. Please try again. So yeah, I've definitely found, the industry to be very eager to help people understand what they're doing.
Now, does Payload primarily report on space tourism, asteroid mining? What do you typically like to focus on as far as the topics? I know you guys are primarily policy related, but what are some of the topics that you like to focus on?
Yeah, so we, because we really focus on like the business and investment side of space, we cover a lot of funding announcements, company news. Major contracts might get a story, but we also have like a rotating section that comes out once a week called the Contract Report, where we run down, the space contracts that were awarded that week. Any sort of investment or hiring or growth that companies are planning, trends in the industry that we spot. And then on the policy side, any sort of space legislation, space budgets, policy changes, because so much of what's going on in space, the government has a role in approving or authorizing in some way. So those are kind of our bread and butter for stories. And we are mostly with a US lens right now, though we covered the Indian mission to the moon recently. We covered the Russian mission to the moon. So we'll cover major international news, but we're primarily US focused for right now. That most space coverage focuses around launch and tourism and SpaceX, Blue Origin, kind of the big players. It's probably 80% that, 20% everything else for some mainstream publications with a space reporter. We try to flip that, so we cover space tourism and we cover launches, but that's like a smaller, probably about 20% of our coverage. We try to focus the bulk of our coverage on these startups that are doing incredible things that are maybe below the level of what a mainstream publication would cover.
That makes sense. Yeah. So you guys are focusing on the side of the business that gets ignored often, right? Everyone's excited about the launch because that means that's the company that made it through, that crevice of death, right? But I'm excited to read about you guys and how, you're keeping up with the funding, who's getting money, who's trying to do what. And I guess, of course, if you're in this industry, that's what you really care about, to see, one, where you can invest your money, or two, what competitors are out there. You talked about focusing on the side of the industry that's sometimes neglected, right? The raising, the people trying to actually build things from the ground level, as most people would focus on launches and, the exciting parts of the business. And I'm curious, with that approach, being that more niche subject matter expert, how do you feel you all have established yourself as like a credible source in the industry? Do you feel like people are referencing you all a lot? Do they use your information to make large decisions, or like how do you feel like that progress is going there?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that we're starting to be viewed as like an established, respected media organization within the sphere. I was out at Space Symposium, which is this big annual conference out in Colorado Springs in April. And so, those are kind of our people, like that's our core readers. But it was great to be walking around in my Payload hat and have people stop me and say they read it. So I do think we're starting to, be really read widespread through the space industry. And you said that, everyone else is covering the exciting parts of the industry, like launch. I would argue that there's actually a lot of exciting stuff going on that we're covering, right? Like the investing is fascinating. And you talk about active debris removal, like going up and wrestling satellites out of space, and gas stations in space that are refueling satellites in orbit, commercial space stations in orbit that are going to replace the ISS. While it's not as flashy as launch, maybe there's not a lot to see from Earth, I think everyone else is missing the exciting stuff. There's a lot of really, really cool stuff happening that we are covering.
Yeah, and thank you for correcting me. You're right. It's not the exciting parts. I think I agree. I think the exciting parts are the, outer space gas stations, the debris, cleanup, the asteroid mining, the possible bases and commercial, space stations. And I think you said it correctly. It's the flashy stuff that gets covered the most, right? Not the things that still, where we want to focus on is the kind of sci-fi nature of the things that are going on. I think people hear asteroid mining and they're like, oh, that's just something out of a novel or a movie. But it's like, actually, it could be a possibility in the next 2 decades if we really focus on it and build out the technology. So again, so thank you for correcting me and showing that the side of space you guys are covering and we hope to cover as a part of our journey is the actual exciting part.
No, I agree. I think one of the things that gets missed is the investing side of space, because I'm always asking the question of how can I invest in this space technology, especially, the big buzzword asteroid mining. You see on all these TikToks, YouTube videos, the big major headline, the first trillionaire will be made through asteroid mining. So I feel like investing in, space related technologies just doesn't get covered enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really interesting business to invest in because you do need so much capital up front. Asteroid mining is not a cheap endeavor by any means, and it's not really proven yet. There's a lot, of talk, as you say, about the money that can be made in space, but we don't really know exactly what's out there. So you have to make a bit of a risky bet that could pay off big time or could kind of be a flop, which I guess is what investing is. You just have to do it smartly. But yeah, part of the reason Payload started was because our co-founders really saw a gap in coverage of the investing side of space.
Talking about the business model of Payload, do you all are focused on solely space and think that's the only area you're going to stick to, or will you eventually cover other topics that might be space adjacent or space related in some sort?
Yeah, I think right now our focus is space and is going to remain space. We definitely don't have any plans to branch out beyond space. Payload started explicitly because our co-founders met and were struggling with a lack of media coverage, specifically on the investing side. One of our co-founders was working, as an investment banker and saw all of this exciting investing happening, but didn't really see any coverage of it. There were kind of the traditional trade publications and very expensive research products intended for professionals, but not a lot in between. So Payload was really founded specifically to fill this gap in the space sector. And I think the space sector is really where our focus will remain.
Now, one thing that I appreciate about Payload is that you guys put out something every single day. How do you decide on what to cover for that day? Because it's so difficult to just, have content one day to the next, especially, for you guys, I feel like the space industry in general, it's what gets covered is the breaking headline. So how do you, do that research?
Yeah, it's a good question. A daily newsletter is definitely a bit of a grind. There are weeks, especially conference weeks, when everyone is releasing stuff and it is like a fire hose. And then there are weeks where we are, working more on enterprise stories and Q&As and figuring out what we can offer our readers on a slower news week. I think, staying, closely watching the industry, staying in touch with sources. We're very lucky to get a lot of pitches by email for both interviews and news. And, when I was at Politico, we had a weekly space newsletter that at one time ramped up to 3 times a week. It published Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and they ended up scaling it back. And this was, 2018. So I guess 5 years ago now. And now, while there may be slower days or slower weeks, we can fill a daily newsletter with everything that's happening. There's really lots of news to come out, and more often than not, we are, picking and choosing and getting to be pretty selective about the kind of stuff we cover. So it really shows what an exciting time it is, this industry, that there is so much news happening really all the time.
How have you seen the adoption rate or the excitement in the space industry kind of grow as you've been with Payload? Because I know, there was a long time where space was just kind of a quiet topic. Nothing much was going on the headlines because people lost interest. And I think in the past 2 to 3 years, maybe more, that interest has come back, and it's come back very strong. Obviously, we see a lot of nation states performing missions now. Companies are coming out of the woodworks to accomplish these new missions in space. How have you seen it from your end?
Yeah, absolutely. I think excitement about space has really ramped up so much, both within the industry and, outside of it. I think casual observers are thinking about space again in a way that they weren't before. You mentioned all the international missions, and I I don't like to call it a new space race, but people are undoubtedly, all charging towards the moon, which is very, very exciting. You have everything that NASA is doing, the naming of the Artemis astronauts, the fact that the US can launch astronauts from American soil again for the first time in decades, since the shuttle program shuttered, which is very exciting. The first crewed launch from American soil was such a flashy thing, and now crews go up all the time and it's kind of no big deal, which is sad given how miraculous it is, but also very exciting that this is kind of something that's so commonplace. Um, on the science side of it, to have James Webb putting out images. I have family and friends who aren't in the space industry, but they see these crazy pictures of our universe being covered by mainstream news organizations. So there's obviously so much going on there. And then on the civil side, to have, I think people kind of broadly know what Starlink is, what SpaceX is. That the Starship launch was a super exciting thing for the industry. And space tourism, like you were talking about asteroid mining, that people think, oh, this is sci-fi. I think a lot of people maybe still think that space tourism is this thing in the future. And granted, many people can't afford it today, but it is something that's happening today. Like, people of all different backgrounds are paying to get to the edge of space, or paying to go stay on the space station, which is unthinkable. Like, it's crazy. You can tell I get really excited about this stuff. Um, so yeah, I forgot your question. I got so, suffice to say that there's a lot going on to drive this excitement.
So that's a first for me. I did not know that you could pay to go stay on the ISS.
Yeah.
I know Virgin Galactic has had their two space flights, and I will casually just watch them throughout the workday. Probably should be working, but there I am watching the space flights, and I think only excitement will be, it'll increase with the more accessibility to be able to do those things. One of our previous guests mentioned, he compared, space tourism to being the same way the flight industry took off. It was only the rich and famous that could fly in an airplane, and eventually, hopefully, space tourism just becomes cheaper and more accessible to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously the hope, both to be able to, go to the edge of space. And I think when you see the world from space, you realize that, you can't see the borders of countries from space, and you can see how fragile the atmosphere is. And pretty much everyone who's been to space comes back and is like, our similarities are greater than our differences as a human race, and like, we need to take care of the earth. So I think there's a benefit of that. But from a more potentially, less aspirational, more practical sense, you talk about point to point flight of going up to space and being able to go from New York to Tokyo in a couple hours. Like, there are huge economic implications of space travel becoming, more realistic and more accessible. So I think, that I don't know that that's something that's realistic in the super short term, but each of these paid flights is really taking a step towards that, which is really exciting.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there are a couple of good examples of how quickly space travel or how efficient space travel is, right? You have the ISS that goes around the Earth, every 90 minutes or so, right? That's one full, revolution. And then, a bad but also interesting side of it is like ICBMs, right? An ICBM can reach any point in the world within 20 or 30 minutes, right? So now make that more practical to a business sense. A flight in space can get from New York to Paris, New York to Tokyo in a matter of 15, 20, 30 minutes or so if they needed to. So I can see how that could make a business boom. And of course, when it comes to asteroid mining, or space industry, like, that's more resources that we can use, not only for more space travel, potentially to help the planet as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, from sort of an environmental point of view, lots of people have talked about the benefits of exploring space and being able to, move manufacturing off the planet. Again, this is, much farther out, or, be able to extract resources from other places, to not be doing it on Earth, to protect kind of the terrestrial environment. So I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity there.
So now I have a quick question. Given that there's all these startups that are just, popping up, one thing that I've been noticing is, a lot of people are mentioning there's the space industry is highly regulated. Do you believe that, regulation has kind of limited, the advancement of space technology, or do you believe it's a necessary function of, the space industry, because you don't want just anybody just launching a rocket or something similar to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially as the industry grows, regulation is sort of a non-negotiable part of it, right? Like airlines are regulated and trucking is regulated and shipping, like anything comparable does have regulations, in part for safety and in part for, economic reasons, or other things. So I do think that, regulation is going to be a greater part of the space industry. There's actually an interesting milestone coming up at the end of September. Right now, there's a moratorium on any sort of rulemaking specifically for space tourism. So the government is not allowed to impose these rules, in part because of what you said, that rules can stifle the industry and space tourism is so new. So the industry has gotten this extended multiple times. That's taken a little bit longer to take off, pun intended. But at the end of September, without action from Congress, this moratorium will end. So the FAA will be able to regulate space tourism flights. So, you mentioned Virgin Galactic, but also Blue Origin and SpaceX, which is launching people to the ISS via Axiom, or launching, private astronauts to the ISS via Axiom. So it's something that I'm watching very closely, and the Payload is watching very closely to see, Congress has a lot on its to-do plate, and if they do nothing, it kind of opens up this whole sector of the space industry to regulation. But even if it doesn't happen right now, I think we're definitely heading that way.
Sense. Yeah, it was interesting. We were at that conference Christian mentioned. We were talking to someone that had worked closely with a couple different, space startups, and the fun fact he told us is how much control Space Force has on these launches. Right, like they have the ability to scrub it if they feel like it's unsafe or something went wrong. But I am curious. Do you feel like that might lead to a bit of government overreach, of favoritism, right? Whether, if Elon Musk gets on the government's bad side, will they start scrubbing SpaceX launches to be a bit spiteful, compared to others? Or do you feel like there isn't room for that just yet?
Yeah, it feels unlikely to me right now, in part because like the military needs SpaceX as much as SpaceX needs the military. Like they're doing a lot of a lot of launches, and like SpaceX is how the US right now can get its NASA astronauts to. I also think there's a push for civil spaceports more akin to an airport than a military range that would be controlled by the Space Force. So as there are a bunch of them right now, but they're not super being like widespread. There's not widespread use of them just because there aren't. I don't know if there are enough launches to make it make sense right now, but as launch cadence ramps up, there are going to be civil ranges that aren't under military control. One company the spaceport company is doing this really cool thing. They're like launching from pads at sea. You just like roll a shipping container out to sea, take off, and then come back. So companies are definitely going to have launch options other than military ranges, and the military is like relying on a lot of these launch companies as well, and has a pretty good relationship with them so far.
Have you ever had the opportunity to see an actual launch in person?
I have. I've gotten to go to two, and they were both incredible. They were both down at Cape Canaveral in Florida. One was just a resupply mission to the ISS. It was a SpaceX launch, but being my first one, it was incredible. I also had the opportunity to go to the first crewed launch, so the Demo 2 mission for the SpaceX Crew Dragon, I got to fly down with Vice President Pence and watch from like behind where they got to watch. So I had a great view of that one, which was great. But it was, I mean, knowing there were people on top of that rocket, I was bawling. I had sunglasses on. I was just crying because it's such a cool thing to be like, we are like, we as humans have built this thing that can escape gravity and send people into space. And, you know, being the first launch from American soil since the shuttle program was scrapped, it was a really incredible experience to be there.
That is super cool. So hold on, we have to go back. How did you get to fly down with Vice President Pence and see this? Was it through Payload? Was it just through old connection?
No, so this was when I was at Politico. And I mean, this goes back to the source building we talked about. I Vice President Pence is a big space geek. So I had chatted with him a couple times before about the establishment of the Space Force. I had gotten to go to the White House for, I think it was when General Raymond was sworn in as like the first official member of the Space Force. So I knew some people in his office and had chatted with him and just got a call asking me if I wanted an extra seat on the plane and got to go down and see the launch and, you know, talk with him and report on it. So it was a really great opportunity.
That is super cool. If you ever get the opportunity and can't go, I will more than gladly take your seat if necessary.
Yeah, that sounds like such a exciting and, like you mentioned, emotional experience. Yeah, just to even think of how far we've advanced technology wise, and to even think that there's humans out there, traversing the cosmos is amazing. So now I want to get back to Payload. You guys, I feel like you guys have had major success in the past 2 years. What do you think what has contributed to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it really is that our co-founders thankfully, you know, saw this gap in coverage in the industry and we were able to fill it. Like I do think the industry has been kind of hungry for someone to cover this. Uh, I also just think, you know, everyone on the team works really hard and, you know, everyone is lucky to have a stake in the company. So, you know, everyone has both, you know, a personal pride aspect in wanting the company to succeed, but also a potentially financial stake in wanting the company to succeed. So it is, the team is really small but scrappy. I've never worked with people who work this hard. So I definitely think kind of the hustle is a big part of it. We have 7 full-time employees right now, and our newsroom is just 3 people plus 2 sort of regular freelancers. So we're definitely small but mighty, and just a lot of hard work.
Yeah, that's impressive. I thought the team would be larger for the amount of content you pull out. So kudos to you all for the fantastic work you guys are doing.
Thank you. Yeah, we're definitely a small team, but it makes for like a close knit work environment for sure. I really love my colleagues.
Yeah, I can imagine the culture. It must feel like you're just always on the grind, but like progressing and seeing the progress. So it must be an exciting time for you all.
Exactly. I mean, I've never worked at a startup before, and it's incredible to see we can like have an idea and just do it. You know, there's no, and that's, I mean, it has pros and cons, but there's no bureaucracy, there's no red tape. And it's incredible to see how quickly something can go from like idea to reality to success. It's been really exciting.
Where do you see Payload in the next, 3 to 5 years? Yeah, as I think the space hype cycle just accelerates now with all these new missions and funding coming in, and of course, as people are looking to find out more about the industry and how to get involved.
News at all. I think the newsletter will always be kind of our signature product, given that that's what we started. And I think so many people like receiving news in their inbox. But we do have a new website in the works, which is very exciting. So I really see us getting kind of more into the web first game, doing more longer form reporting, more web first reporting, which again, I think is a gap in the space industry. There are some people doing it, but many of them are, you know, space writers at The Atlantic or The Post or The Wall Street Journal. who can't necessarily get down to the level of the industry that we're reporting on. So I hope to see us doing, more digging in at that level. I hope you'll see the newsroom grow even more. And I think, our events business is really something to watch. It's been incredible to see kind of early on what we've been able to put together. We had our first DC event in June of this year. We're having a second already in September because the first one went so well. And I think there's such a demand to kind of convene the industry and be able to get together to, listen to an interesting panel and then, network over a drink. So I really see Payload as being this convener of the space industry and expect us to do a lot more of that.
Now, I know you guys do a lot of events in Austin. Jonathan and I hopefully would like to make it to one of those. Someone had at the conference, someone had mentioned that you guys recently did one of those events in Austin. So that's really exciting. Now, so kind of a more of a, I guess, personal question outside of, the space industry. What other, industries or emerging technologies are you excited for?
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about AI, specifically how it impacts journalism. I think there are like exciting opportunities for, thinking about sports coverage. Like, do you need a person to write a game coverage story if you can put a box score into an AI generator? Maybe not. It also, journalism can we do that a machine can't? Like, what can we offer that can't be replaced by AI? So I think that the journalism industry is definitely really just starting to wrestle with this about how it can use AI and how it can make sure that it doesn't get killed by AI. And to be clear, like, I think there'll always be a need for journalism written by real human beings, but it's something that, we are starting to talk about internally, and something, I'm starting to talk about with journalists at other publications too, kind of how their companies are starting to handle that.
That makes sense. Have you seen any pretty good use cases so far? Kind of scoping out the industry and their use case of AI.
The interesting thing is that it's hard to tell what is being written by AI. Like, I think there's, the industry is dealing with sort of the ethical issue of how do you put a byline on something that's written by a computer. So I think a lot of places would just, and to be clear, we don't have AI writing like any editorial content right now. But I think other places would put like Payload staff as the byline. So like you don't exactly know what it's doing, but things like going through a lot of data. A computer is going to be really accurate with those numbers. Things like an earnings report. Is that something that AI could at least take a first draft at, and then a person could go through and smooth out and add context? I think there are some interesting use cases there.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's something I'm always interested in. I use AI every now and then to like revise a draft of something, and it's hilarious because I had a kid trying to write an email to send to. He's trying to get recruited for college, and he tried to send an email to the college coach, and I could tell he used ChatGPT completely for the email because this is not how he talks, right? So I'd be curious, how these writing professionals would try to either supplement their writing experience and expertise with AI, or maybe even just outsource their job a bit. And so I'd be interested to see how you guys approach that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have this like awards program right now that's going on. It's the Payload Pioneers. So we're doing like a 30 under 30 in the space industry. And I collected headshots from some of the finalists, and I'm pretty sure I got an AI generated headshot. Like it looks a little too perfect. And I'm like, is this really happening?
But yeah, I've seen those too. I've seen like resumes come in and people have like the AI generated headshots, and some of them are clearly AI generated, and others you're like, wow, either this person is like picture perfect,
Yeah.
or they edit this really well. Yeah, it's weird. I think things are gonna get really weird in the next 5 years as we get used to the the saturation of AI. But awesome. Well, I had one more question, and I don't know if Tate will bounce back here, but so we talked about space tourism, some of these space flights going on. If you had the chance, would you take the trip to Mars just yet?
I absolutely would not. I am not the most adventurous person. I like get kind of car sick, and I don't think it would be a great fit for me. I would think about like something like a Virgin or a Blue Origin to kind of go up to the edge of space, but interplanetary travel is not something I'm going to be comfortable with just yet.
Just yet, okay. Maybe in 30 years or so, right?
Maybe.
Once you retire and you want your nice space villa, right, you'll go to Mars.
Exactly. There you go.
Awesome. Well, I'm out of questions. Christian, I don't know if you had another question for Jacqueline.
No, I am good. Thank you, Jacqueline. It was a pleasure having you on. As I mentioned earlier, we're big fans of what you guys are doing at Payload, and we hope that you guys continue to grow and have, major success here in the near future.
Jacqueline, can you hear Christian?
I cannot. I can't see his little box. Like he's popped up, but I can't see his video.
Okay. Another struggle. He basically said, thank you for coming on, and that, we hope that we continue to see the success of Payload. We're big fans. So of course we'll be reading and watching you all grow as you do it. And, hopefully in the near future, we can have you guys back on and maybe see what you guys have done since then and from now till then, and just continue this interaction. But yeah, thank you again. And thank you for your time. I know it's the middle of the day. I know you're probably going to want to go grab lunch really quickly. So we'll go ahead and stop wasting your time.
Absolutely. No, I really appreciate you guys having me on, and thanks for what you do.
Do you have any, closing remarks or social media that you would like to share?
So if you're, interested by any of this, definitely go out to payloadspace.com. You can subscribe there to the daily newsletter as well as both weekly newsletters. So that's probably the best way to keep in touch with us if you're interested in doing so and staying up to date on the space industry.
Sounds good. We'll add the links to our description and, hopefully we get you some subscribers.
Very much appreciated.